quite summer, although it feels like that. My name is Glenn Bessa, and I'm the director of the Sierra Club here in Virginia. And we're very pleased to be putting together this thought leader panel that the Sierra Club and a number of other organizations are working on throughout the summer to bring attention to the issue of climate change and what the president can do about it, what we can do about it. The other organizations besides the Sierra Club that are involved in this climate action partnership or climate action campaign are the Virginia Conservation Network, and Chelsea Harnish is an organizer with the Virginia Conservation Network. If you belong to another environmental group, they're probably a member of VCN. Additionally, Environment Virginia doesn't have a representative here today, but Environment Virginia is a nationwide group affiliated with Environment America. They're one of our partners, and then also Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. We're pleased to have the director of Virginia Interfaith Power and Light on our panel today. So, Katie Preston. So, again, thank you so much for coming this evening. When we put this panel together, let's go ahead and introduce our other panelists too. Jean Pupke, Reverend Jean Pupke, is the minister here at this church and was gracious to host us in the sanctuary. We really appreciate it very much. And Rabbi Ben Romer, I've had the pleasure to work with him on a number of other issues. He's from West Virginia. He'll tell you a little bit about that, I'm sure, in his comments. But he's Rabbi Congregation for Avi. And since I didn't really prepare detailed bios, if you'd like to add a little bit more about yourself when we get to that, that'd be great, okay? All right, so when we put this panel together, you know, the Sierra Club and the other groups get a lot of advice from marketing professionals. And they say, talk about health, talk about women's issues related to climate change, but, you know, maybe don't talk about the moral consequences and don't talk about the bad stuff. Don't talk about how bad it's going to be. Talk about what we can do. You know, and there's a lot of truth to that. We really do need to talk about solutions, because without solutions, people lose hope and leaders don't have anything to actually move towards. So, but I thought it was important, particularly as we start off this Thought Leaders Forum panel, that we really focus on what really is a moral imperative. And I don't know how many of you picked it up at the front, but it's on a white piece of paper, and I have it on a blue piece of paper here. But it's report, this was in the Richmond Times-Dispatch today, one day after two big articles on how great natural gas is. But the article basically is titled, Report, Global Pollution on a Dangerous Trajectory. The subtitle is, Temperature Increases on Track to Create Disaster for All Countries. And bottom line is even though the U.S. emissions have gone down, haven't gone down that much, and even though China's emissions are not as increasing as rapidly as they were, the bottom line is we're still full bore for climate Armageddon. And what that means is a 9% increase in temperatures Fahrenheit and all the consequences that come with that. We want to talk about the moral implications of climate change, and also why it's incredibly important to act. There's another document out there that I point you to too, and it was done by the Union of Concerned Scientists. It's from the it's a summary of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That body of thousands of scientists around the world who work on these issues, everything from measuring glacier movement to examining ice coolers to things like observing the migration changes of birds. All of these things are things that contribute, and not to mention issues with regard to human health that are incredibly important. The IPCC goes into issues with regard to mitigation, how we will reduce it, and also impacts what happens if we, regardless of whether we do something now or not. So I wanted to just frame some of the moral issues that came to my mind, because this is a complex issue. And I think because it's complex, a lot of politicians are not inclined to do anything. And also because the worst consequences are going to actually happen after their next election, maybe after they retire from office, that so few actually feel an obligation. And this is particularly true in Virginia, where unfortunately our Democrats, and most notably our Republicans, are either climate skeptics or certainly not taking up the responsibilities that they need to address this issue. Obviously, on the Republican side, we've got outright skeptics that basically say that climate change is a hoax. On the Democratic side, we've got people who say they believe in climate change, but don't seem to be inclined to do anything about it. And that's why, as we move into this program, we're going to be talking to you about what you can do and why it's a moral imperative that we do it. Not just the politicians, but that we do it. So let me just outline a few of the ethical questions that arise tonight, because we've got people of faith here who I think will address it from different perspectives, and then we'll have room and time for comments as well, and your questions and thoughts on these things. So first off, there is an intergenerational justice question, okay? What do we owe future generations? Your grandchildren, or maybe people that, won't be here until 100 years from now when we're long gone. What do we owe them? Are we going to leave them a world that is significantly diminished with respect to what we have? And what do we owe them? Is there a moral obligation to these people? And I think most faiths speak to the issue. Then there's a question of justice between classes. And, in this country we don't like to talk about classes, but we certainly do have them. And how do we, if we get serious about assessing the costs of pollution and what we need to do about it, because it's not going to be free. Who pays and how do they pay? What about the coal miner that loses his job in Appalachia as we crack down on carbon? I mean, they're already losing their job for other reasons like natural gas and mechanization of the coal fields, but certainly there will be people who will be dislocated as a result of serious actions on climate when we take those. And then how much do we help them in our own country? And then similarly, what about those folks who can afford a lot more and who also generally have larger carbon footprints? I mean, if you fly everywhere you go once a week, and there's people that do that, they got a pretty big carbon footprint. How do you assess the cost associated with that? So there's ethical questions here, and then there's policy questions. And another question is, what about the justice between nations and between peoples? We know that the poorest nations in the world are experiencing some of the worst consequences of climate change. They live in areas like Bangladesh, where millions of people live at sea level, and we'll be literally putting tens of millions of people on the move as sea level rises, people who are referred to as climate refugees in some quarters. Something you haven't heard about, but the Mekong Delta. Vietnam is the rice belt for Asia. They feed a lot of Asia. And saltwater intrusion into the Mekong Delta as a result of sea level rise is going to result in significant losses in production that could actually result in massive famine. Another problem out there. Okay, and then you've got desertification in Africa. You're seeing these severe droughts impacting that. So these create equity issues between nations. What does the United States, a very wealthy country that's been contributing a lot of the carbon for the last 150 years or more, what are their obligations to these other countries? We have a lot of leaders who shake their finger at China and say China's the largest emitter. Well, that's a relatively recent occurrence. And as a practical matter, most of the carbon in the atmosphere is a result of the United States and Europe. So there are these complex questions with regard to who used it up. I mean, we've used it up. And so while the Chinese are doing a lot to alleviate poverty in a country, similarly with India and other countries, even countries in Africa, how do we ask them to reduce their carbon footprint in a time when we've used up most of that carbon budget that the country has? Another question that's out there that really needs to be addressed, and while there are policy questions about how to do it, there's fundamentally ethical questions about what obligation we have. I know I've been to a number of the climate summits that the United States sponsors, and the position of the United States, and this is the position under Bush and the position under Obama too, and is that we start today. We don't look at the historic contributions or historic withdrawals of the carbon budget that countries like the United States made. So there's actually a refusal on the part of the Obama administration to even acknowledge the fact that in calculating out how much carbon people have a right to produce, that you don't have to look back at what the United States and Europe have already done. That's the current position of the United States government. So these are the real ethical questions that are out there. Another one I'll just point to is, and this is another issue that comes up in UN negotiations, and that is Okay, to what extent do countries like the United States, and maybe even China with their advanced technology and renewable energy, what obligation do they owe to poor countries to share that technology? You know, we have a patent system in this country and around the world means that if you invent this technology, you have a right to charge for it. Okay, but if you're trying to get people in Asia or people in Africa to develop along a different path, a soft energy path, not a hard energy path, not a dirty energy path, then you're going to have to provide them with the opportunities to use photovoltaics, to use wind, and to not have to pay the kind of costs that we would pay in terms of patents to do this. So these are the kind of questions that come up. Last January, President Obama made two important speeches. One was his second inaugural address, and the other was his State of the Union address. And in both instances, he mentioned that we have an obligation to do something about climate change, and that if the Congress didn't, he would. The good news is that we actually have taken some steps to higher efficiency automobiles, certain limits with regard to mercury pollution and such have made it more difficult to burn coal, reducing our emissions. And then, largely due to market forces, natural gas has, the price of natural gas has dropped, and so we switched from coal to gas, and that's actually reduced our emissions. But as we continue to burn more gas and meet future needs with more gas, those emissions will rise. And in fact, I'll just share with you from the perspective of Dominion Virginia Power, they're actually predicting something in the order of a 25 to 30% increase in carbon emissions between now and 2030. That's their plan. The plan that Dominion Virginia Power has, as Virginia's largest utility, is to actually increase their CO2 emissions by 30% between now and 2030. That's what they actually have on the books right now. So how do we deal with those things? Well, let me say this. The first thing we have to deal with is we have to agree that there is a serious problem here. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the politicians, Democrats, Republicans, either disagree that it's a problem or don't seem to be acting upon this as a serious problem. And so we have to convince them that it's very serious, then we have to convince them to take action. Once we've done that, then there's a lot of debate. You know, is cap and trade better than a carbon tax? You know, how do we address the issues of equity, both between peoples and between nations? Those are honest questions that there can be honest disagreement on, as long as we're working towards the same goal of reducing carbon pollution. But until we define some of the ethical questions there and the issues of justice that relate to them, only that will help us inform how we go about these issues as well. So we're going to really get into these complex issues, and I know we've got some great panelists who are going to share with you their perspectives on climate change and as people of faith, how they address it. And I'm not going to speak for them, but at this point in time, I'm going to turn it over to Reverend Gene Pupke, who is going to talk about this. And each of the speakers has about 10 minutes, so we should have a fair amount of time for discussion as well. But I'd like to hold questions and discussion until the end, and then have at it in terms of your participation. So again, thank you so much for coming this evening, and we look forward to a good debate, a good discussion. Thank you, Reverend Pupke.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the First Unitarian Universalist Church. We're always glad to offer two things here. One is shelter for people doing good work, and the other one is the raising of moral questions, which helps us to achieve our mission by learning from all of you and also